Welcome back to the Climate Playbook series. This is Barney Wong with One Tiny Drop. For this episode, episode 10, I'd like to take us on a journey into examining the limits of ontological security. Episode 8 and 9, we talked about the components that went into making us ontologically secured with car use. For this episode, I'd like to summarize that, followed by I'd like to move on into seeing there's a shadow side to ontological security. And what are the behavioral problems in that shadow side that points to the problems in the construction of self. So it will be this will be a build up to the next series of videos with pointing to the construction of self. So I want to take us firstly through summarizing ontological security. As we can see that ontological security made up the major components of predictability, autonomy, and acceptance. And from that, in predictability, we had routine, we had a decoupling of homes from workplaces so that they can exist or be secured independently. There's a normality that goes in predictability where we can go from a smaller home to a larger home. And in autonomy, we have mastery as a way of participating in the workforce, in working overtime, and also to gain the fruits of participating in the workforce. There's a freedom from unwanted interaction, especially on buses, also freedom from a fixed timetable and fixed routes, and also freedom from, such as work, can we have private spaces, such as the car, where we can enjoy our own personal music, and also we can enjoy our own private time away from home and away from work. In acceptance, we have a sense of belonging where we will not outcast from looking different, from being sweaty, having to bike to work or to meeting. In this case, you can see the person is different from the rest of the people in the meeting. There's a sense of approval where we are flexible to work overtime, and we can also have the flexibility to attend to cross-town meetings with a car. And lastly, self-care, where we can avoid inclement weather, and also interaction with people that we didn't want to interact with. So that's the quick summary where ontological security enables a firmness sense of self in interaction in our social interactions and in our work interactions, and allows us to have a grounding of ourselves in this world and to live our lives. I want to take us to, well, before that, the question is, why should we care about ontological security? And the reason why we care is ontological security is achieved by routinizing the relationship with significant others. And however, participants in that routine become attached to those relationships. So just like the physical counterpart where we talked about habits, where we chase after calories and energy, this ontological security is motivated by having a constant. So we are warding off everyday disturbances to this constant, and it allows us to achieve the need for security, or the need for identity security that's behind this constant. So by weaving in car use into fulfilling our daily modern living, driven by this constant motive, we are also weaving in car use into the construction of self-identity in an unconscious and unchallenged way. So in some sense, this collective car use can be interpreted as a way to be resilient to or manage our everyday anxiety of the unknown. And this means that this securitizing our identity embeds the car use into powerful habits. And this in turn puts more time on device. And it's much like the casino motivation for nudging gamblers to spend more time on slot machines. So when we have more time on the device, we're weaving in the car use into fulfilling our daily modern living. But we also weave in car use into the construction of identity in an unconscious way. This powerful symbolic context keeps us from giving up the habit of car use. It further embeds car use into the unconscious as pre-given, so it makes it unavailable to be challenged when situations such as climate change requires us to open car use to question. So that is the quick summary on the enabling side of ontological security. I want to segue us into the shadow side of ontological security. I'll be touching on the work of Chris Rosdale from 2017, where he wrote a paper and closing critique the limits of ontological security. And this is a critique on ontological security where he draws upon composite thinkers from the feminist theory, from queer theory, and also the anti-military social movement. And in a nutshell, the shadow side of ontological security is that it's the same breeding ground for social injustice, economic injustice, and ecological injustice. And lastly, it adds energy, calorie, and extraction pressure on the planet. So on ontological security, on the shadow side, there are three qualities that I want to bring up that is critical here. The shadow side to the positive, the enabling side of prediction, autonomy, and self-care is it is impositive. And impositive is a composite word from impossible and positive. And I'll talk about it more as we get into the body, the constitutions that behind impositiveness. It's also repressive, and also it's regressive. And I'll cover this as I go along. And let's look at the first one, which is angst, under impositive. Angst is used to describe an intense feeling of apprehension, anxiety, or inner turmoil. And with angst, I'm going to use the analogy of the Truman Show, where Truman himself is driving in this turning circle or roundabout in a way that because he was demonstrating his frustration with the system, where everything was so routinized, he developed a very strong angst against that routinized living. So here he is, he's driving in a circle with his wife, round and round and round, as a way to express his angst. So in ontological security, there's a drive for constancy, for identity and agency to flourish. However, that produces angst, where there's a clash between routinized living and a formless sense of being, which is the freeing version of ourselves. However, this constancy shuts down the grounds for ethical relationships, and this is from Donna Haraway. So, angst is a form of stifling security, a feeling of being bottled or hammed up by routine. But Donna Haraway, as she says here, is this constancy, this routinized living that forecloses any questioning, examining, debate, and impact consideration by those affected. So, as I was saying, the constancy is driving Truman to drive round this roundabout, as he managed to eventually see his life was this repeating but monotonous pattern in his daily events. He no longer accepts this constancy as he feels imprisoned by it. But there is a benefit to constancy and also the downside simultaneously. It makes us believe the world revolves around us. Much like Truman, we are often a prisoner knowing that, causing us to background deeper considerations, as there's no reason to change, or there's no reasons for change. There's no new harm that invades this constant world to disrupt the status quo, and thus there's no ethical consideration to maintain this constancy, as what Donna Haraway says in the sentence right here. So it's impossible to be ontologically secured because we feel a sense of angst, this antagonistic relationship with a constant world. Let's go to the second one, where there's no center. This securitizing our identity has a premise that there's a center we're fulfilling. So we're going to take a look at 3 sources that points that there is no unified, singular, continuous center that we're serving. There's an impossible drive for an identifiable, continuous, singular self. And that impossibility, let's take a look at these 3 sources, how we can identify this impossibility. Because this form of ontological security can lead to the loss of ethical connections with others. So the first one is feminist theory. And I'd like to take a look at the work of Judith Butler in her body of work, Giving an Account of Oneself. And I want to quickly use this meme right here, or this illustration. There's this older fish that, in passing, said to these younger fish, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the younger fish asked, "What the hell is water?" So in some ways, it captures my understanding of her body of work, Giving an Accounting of Oneself, that the ontological security is looking, its premises that there's a center in self and there's coherence in self. But just like water, where the young fish is asking, "What the hell is water?" It's there, it enables them, but at the same time, it's so taken for granted, it's not accessible to them in terms of being salient to their everydayness processes. Judith said that it's because there is no center, or in this case, decenter, there's no coherence, or in this case, incoherence, that this is the source of ethics, responsibility, and dependence on others. So, in this slide, it's in the foreignness to myself that is the source of my ethical connection with others. And foreignness is not to be confused with alienation. Foreignness is just aspects of ourselves that we don't have an antagonistic relationship with. It is a flexible sense of self that is not antagonistic to self, and thus there's no inner conflict, to others. And ironically, against the thought of being in control of our wills and destiny can there be responsibility and hence being ethical, where she argues that responsibility flows only from a self, not entombed in self-mastery. And she also uses the idea that we are entwined with forces and power that are not entirely of our own making, just like this younger fish is not able to identify or had any participation in the making of water. So is this entwinement with the forces and power not of our own making, where we are the third twine, is in fact the very condition of our being responsible. In other words, how we have been formed with all of its flaws is the key to understanding how we can reform. And also it is out of the centered and incoherent self that ethics and responsibility flow. So moving on, let's take a look at queer theory as to how can ontological security lead to loss of ethical connections with others. This is the work of Donna Haraway, Sedgwick, and Halberstam. And here is a picture of pigeonholes representing the spectrum of gender. And in a dominant regime of self, there's the belief there is stable identities that can be confined within one pigeonhole. There's a binary will, female, male, and a solid but closed-off sense of self. In other words, we stay within those boundaries and continue to stay within the boundaries. However, this ontological monolith structure rejects the naturalness of queer, where there is incoherence, there are gaps to the identity, there are contradictions, there is incompleteness, and there's fracturedness, where a piece of identity may be not connected to a large body of pieces of identity. So what I have represented here are these green pigeonhole boxes. It may not necessarily be right on the boundaries or the walls of these openings. It could be overlapping right in here, but just for simplicity, it's to show that there is much more spectrum that is rejected by an ontological monolith structure. So Jack Halberstam says it well, is that because the ontological failures, it's because of ontological failures that we can have an alternate ethics of self and of ways of being and relating to each other. So it's like the light spectrum of humans, where we can only have a visible but narrow wavelength that we can see, whereas the light spectrum of other creatures that could see beyond, over, and under the spectrums that we cannot see, that we can see. So the last one is the anti-military social movements. And in here, these are some of the cited authors in Chris Ransdale's paper. And we have here again this binary wall in the military movement, where you are with us, and again this is the Iraq War with George Bush II. As you can see, George Bush II is occupying this spectrum that is being blocked out by him, leaving only binary choices of you're with us or you're against us. So war often requires speedy response from threats, or when there is actual ontological security loss. So what the binary choices do is that it only offers up simple choices with simple emotions in a binary form, so as to accomplish this rapid or the speed of decisions without having to go through the messiness of consensus. However, there is a dark side to that, where this is nothing more than a psychological manipulation using a necessity doctrine, where there's no time to think but to act immediately, as if the threat is impending, and as if President Bush then had the inside scoop of the directness of threat better than we do. So what we can see, the takeaway from this is ontological security can lead to false binaries that forces us into dominant regime of truths. So this impossibility leads to this problem right here, where there's a loss of ethical connection with others. The ever difficult but yet impossible chore of grounding ourselves as centered, coherent, and unified self produces confusion. We're working so hard, but then we are not quite hitting the mark. And this confusion creates aggression against others. It often produces passion to defend our monoliths. And one way is we have a polarized world as a result of recruiting support for our ideology. It often produces compensating and blinding pride, and that is seen in nationalism and cultural dominance or cultural wars. And we expel a range of spectrum that non-binary, such as queer folks, naturally inhabit. And it creates a blindness to the groups that we otherize. We also expel a range of responses that war makes us believe it's illegitimate to be on the table to respond to threats. And this expulsion is furthered by easy slogans and sound bites. So ultimately, we have this loss of nuances in our sensibilities and sensitivities, and we thus have this loss of ethical connection with others. So let's move on to the last piece of impositiveness, which is perpetuating injustices. And this goes to the anti-military social movement. Here we can see a conscientious objector, and we can see those trained. And in ontological security, the anti-military social movement says it's based on a social hierarchy of dominance where its coordinates are based on domination and submission. And the problem with that coordinate is that it tends to create an unconscious and internalized respect for authority. However, the anti-military social movement says that really the unseating of the movement is really an unseating of an internalized foundation where demilitarizing is demilitarizing ourselves from those coordinates of domination and submission that buries the violent foundations that is built on, the contradictions within it, the opacity, not only in the movement, not only in war itself, but also within ourselves, and the non-innocence that is always there. So the takeaway for this is ontological security interrupts the repeating process of self-disclosure. So here, ontological security does not let us embrace part of ourselves we haven't worked out yet, which is part of self-disclosure. It does not allow us to identify aspects of ourselves for further reconciling, but rather bury them for not fitting the dominant regime of truth. And it force-fits us into limited combinations that simply produces more internal conflict, requiring more mindlessness and disembodiment to deal with this conflict. And also it can produce brutal repercussions, a form of psychic violence to ourselves. So let's move on to the second column, which is ontological security. The shadow side of ontological security is repressive, and the first component is conformance. And here we have ontological security, the work of Kinval, where the response to instability is usually nationalism, religious myth, and traumas. And you can see nationalism right here, and it's ironic, you can see the people marching looks like alphabet K. And then you can have religious myths right here, and you can see the mixture of religion and government. And then you have traumas, and you have 9/11 here. So the shadow side behind this response is that it creates outgroups where there's an arbitrary and capricious loss of civil liberties. So as you can see in the current wave of nationalism, the leaders are on that wave are riding on the ticket, let's make this country great again. And that's what this rising tide of nationalism is bringing about, a sense, hey, let's go back to a world where there was simpler emotions, simpler thoughts, and a simpler world. And where there's a dominant group of people in that world. In the religious myths, there's the doctrine of discovery, where the idea was first expressed in the 15th century papal edicts and royal charters and court rulings that justifies the discovery and domination by European Christian of lands already inhabited by indigenous people. So we can also see that in the narrative of chosen people, so as to brutally expel others of land. And religion as an identity signifier are likely to increase this ontological security while minimizing existential anxiety. However, it creates all these problems. So the takeaway here is ontological security excavates known but oppressive ways of response. So the shadow side produce these groups right here where with the people of color, you can see I Can't Breathe. Economic, people who are not part of the economic discourse, and the earliest form was slavery. And you can see there's Jesus here, and there's a black person, and there's a dominant submission pose right here. And American Muslims, and you can see this person clearly distressed as she's been frisked in TSA. And groups that are not part of the white male educated European lineage. So the takeaway with this conformance is that ontological security often legalizes the unconstitutional. The next one is the shadow side is heavy-handedness. And this is Alan Turing. And here, Alan Turing was a famed British mathematician. He helped crack the German code during World War II that helped end the war earlier than if he hadn't been involved. However, he was gay, and he was forced into chemical castration instead of imprisonment. But he committed suicide after that. So you can see there's a heavy-handedness behind ontological security in ensuring the monolith structure of easy choices, binary choices, simpler thoughts, simpler emotions, and simpler will. And the heavy-handedness comes in form of lynching. You can see these are trans people with their photos. They have been lynched. There's imprisonment, there's castration, as with Alan Turing. There's genocides, where we have problems with the Tutsi and Hutus in the 90s, and suicides from bullying and self-harm. So the takeaway for heavy-handedness is ontological security can often lead to violence to enact its monolith structure. And the last piece of repressive is collateral. And here, in the collateral, with the anti-military social movement, the chief pushback on the military movement is that it tends to become its self-living, self-perpetuating movement, where it becomes a great cause for ontological sake of the people. It takes a life of its own, and its chief strategic concerns and efficiency, it's for its own sake. The military industry, for instance, and the profit, and the neoliberalist agenda, etc., over life itself. So it can cause a mass brainwashing where war or the agenda of corporations of pollution takes over life. And you can see Tiananmen Square, where the lone civilian was trying to block the soldiers, but eventually they got crushed. We have people of color living next to refineries. And there's a loss of mutual crafting and shaping of the social field, where the out-group don't have an input or say or leverage. And it finally leads to necessary victims and necessary places where pollution or the harm created by ontological security is placed onto them in a disproportionate way. So the takeaway right here is ontological security can lead to target groups and target places of harm.